I'm Madi with Inspired Leather, and today I'm going to show you how to make your own VooDoo Doll Pincushion similar to this one using the Inspired Leather Pincushion Kit for VooDoo Dolls. Now this video is going to show you step by step how to get a finished product such as this one. So don't worry, you're in good hands and it's going to be so much fun. But a couple of things that I did want to make sure to note before we get started is that down at the bottom here, you'll see chapters listed. If at any point you need to stop and start again later, you can easily just go to the section where you left off. Also, down in the description box, you'll find those chapters with their links also noted. But if at any point you have to stop your stitches because you're running out of thread on that particular line and need to restart, you can find the links to those particular sections on how to restart your stitches down in the description box. So make sure that you take a look for those in case that happens to you. And really, above all else, just have fun while you're making your little pin cushion. Okay, well, let's get started. First, let's go ahead and take a look at what comes in your kit. So in your kit, you'll find a couple of pieces. You'll find all of the leather pieces needed to construct your doll. And on the back, they are numbered, and some of them actually have some reference points on them as well. So you'll need your leather pieces, all of your thread and needles. You will be attaching a needle to each end of the thread as we sew, a black button, and fluff. In addition to those two items, you're also going to need a pair of snips or scissors and a lighter to melt your thread when we get to that part. And two pens, pencils, chopsticks, something that's similarly sized like this. So first, let's start by sewing the face onto our VooDoo Doll Pincushion. So you're going to need your button and piece number 1. On the back, you can see that there's a circle around one of the eye areas. Well, that's where you're going to put your button on the front. So if you flip it over, you see that that circle corresponds with where the button should be placed. And as we're sewing, we're going to sew little X's to secure the eyes and then little dashes around the mouth. And so this back diagram is going to show you how your stitches are going to look on the back. So go ahead and grab one of your needles and your black thread and thread the needle with that thread just like that. Now you can leave your thread like this. I personally like to lock the thread onto my needle. And the way that I do that is by bringing it up and splitting the thread like that, right in the middle with the tip of my needle. And then I just pull it down and then I tighten that up. And now that thread is now locked onto my needle. I don't have to worry about it going anywhere. Now go ahead and grab your head piece along with your button. Place your button over that eye area, making sure that it matches up with the back diagram. And we are going to sew this eye on with a little cross. Now, I like to keep a decent sized tail like that on the back side, and you'll see why in a second. So go ahead and sew your button on with the X's. Okay, and now that button's on there. Now I'm going to come on over to the other eye. And I'm going to sew my X's. And now we're going to go ahead and move right on into the mouthpiece. So I'm going to put it down in this bottom hole. And on this side, I am going to bring my needle right into that upper hole. And we are going to stitch the lips. At this point, you should have plenty of thread left over. What I like to do is tie these threads right here into a knot. I like to tie knots on my pin cushions because it helps secure the threads and nobody's going to be able to see inside the actual pin cushion. And so I'm not worried about people actually seeing the knots. And when you're done with sewing the face onto the head, this is what it looks like. Our next step is to sew all of the slits in the head closed so that way it starts to take its shape. Grab your tan thread and we're going to measure it out. Now I like to measure a generous 4 times the length of what I'm sewing when I'm using a cross stitch, which is what we're going to be doing here. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then also make sure that you include the length of the needle times 2, okay? And cut that thread. For all of the stitches coming up, we're going to be placing a needle on both ends of the thread. So go ahead and grab one of your needles and place it onto the end of your thread. So this is what you should have. And now we are going to start on the back side of our pin cushion. Now, I like to sew from this end in to help keep the ends a little tidy. So go ahead and sink your needles, one into each of those holes, and pull them through. Flip it around and put the needles in the opposite holes, like that. And then pull this taut. You want this to be a really snug stitch. Don't pull it too tight because you don't want to pull your thread through the holes, but you do want to make sure that you're bringing this gap together nicely. And from here, we're going to crisscross on the back. And then just like before, we're going to do the dashes or slashes on the front, just like that, pulling it tight. Okay, continue with the X's on the back. And dashes on the front. This is called a cross stitch. Okay, and so the front of your head should look like this. And when you flip it over, you see that you have all of the X's right down in there. Now at this point, I'm going to show you how to tie 2 different types of knots. So I'll show you how to tie a traditional knot that is used in the leather making community. So take your needle and you're going to put it under the thread that is closest to the hole that your needle just came out of. Pull it through. Flip your needle up and put it through that loop. And then pull tight. And then you can see that there is a little tiny knot on that thread right there. We're going to do it to the other side. Put it through the thread closest to the hole it just came out of. Flip your needle up and put it through and pull tight. Okay, and so we have little dots on both those ends. Trim your thread. Grab your lighter and melt those ends. Just like that. So that's your traditional knot for a cross stitch. Now I'm going to show you how I like to do it. So I'm going to measure this out again, the generous 4 times plus 2 needle lengths. Attach a needle onto each end of your thread. And we're going to start sewing from the back again. Now this is my cheater method for the pin cushions. I just like to tie a double knot at the end here, making sure that I pull this knot pretty tight down at the bottom, so that way it keeps everything together. I snip it and then I don't even bother burning it. And that's what it looks like on the front. And on the back, this is what it looks like. Continue this method using whichever knot method you prefer on the different head slits, and then we're going to attach this to the torso piece number 2. Now that we've finished sewing our head, it's going to look something a little like this. You can see that it's starting to take on that rounded shape, and this is all going to really take form when we add the back. But let's go ahead and move on to piece number 2 now, which is this piece right here. Now for piece number 2, we're going to sew both of these openings on the side closed first, the very same way that we did the head. So we're going to start from the outside, coming in on both ends. So go ahead and sink your needles down into those holes. Cross them in the front. And pull it nice and tight. I'm just going to hold that in place as I do my cross stitch on the back here. And we're going to continue this tying a knot on the inside. So on the back, you can see that we have all of those cross stitches. And then on the front, we have our dashes. Sew this side up and don't forget to tie your knots on the inside. Now that we're done with the torso part, we need to attach it to piece number 1. So we're going to start sewing it from one end to the other using the same cross stitch that we've been doing. So flip it on over to the back. Sink your needles into those holes. And pull it nice and tight. X's on the back, dashes on the front. Okay, now I am starting to run out of thread. So I'm going to show you how to end your stitch and start a new one. So let me tie my knots before it gets too short. Okay, so you can see here, these stitches look pretty good, and we've got a nice clean finish on the back. So I'm going to grab my rethreaded needles, and I am going to start in the holes that I haven't touched yet. So I'm going to sink them right in there. Okay, pull it nice and tight. Let's do the next set. Okay, and you can see that it looks like nothing ever happened from the front side. So go ahead and finish sewing up this end. After you have your head stitched onto the torso, this is what it's going to look like. So now we're ready to move on to our number 3 and 4 pieces. So with these 2 pieces, we are going to finish up these slits right here the same way we did the arms. So they're going to fold in that way, and we're going to sew them using cross stitches. Now remember to start sewing at the end and sew in and tie your knot at this end. So now your 2 pieces should look like this, and they should look pretty identical at this point. So now when we flip it over, you're going to see that there are 2 black dots down on the inside of these 2 pieces. We're going to sew these so that way those 2 dots align like this. And we're going to sew this up using the same cross stitch that we've been doing. So start at one end and go down the row. Don't forget to tie knots at the very end. And when you're done, your legs should look like this. And on the back side, we've got the crosses. Looks great. So now we're going to attach it to the rest of our body the same exact way that we attach the head to the torso. So piece 1 to piece 2. That's the way we're going to attach these 2 pieces. So when you're done sewing it together, you're going to have this little flattened out looking VooDoo pincushion, and this is exactly what it's supposed to look like. The very next step that we're going to do is add in all of the really fun curl loops. Now when we add the curls, we're only going to add them to the first 4 rows. We are not going to add any curls on this row right here. We're going to leave that one empty. So go ahead and grab a pen and grab your thread with 1 needle on one end, and we're going to go ahead and begin. So start by placing your pen over the first row of stitches. Then we're going to turn it over, and we're going to start from the inside. Now you're going to want to leave a tail that's decently long here because we're going to secure this by sewing around it. So on the other side, we're going to put our needle back through the hole and pull it all the way through. Okay. Make sure you don't lose that thread on the other side. We're going to repeat that for the same exact holes here 2 more times. Okay, we now have 2 curl loops. We want 3 in each set of holes on the head. Okay. And now I'm actually going to flip mine this way because I want to be able to hold this thread down as I'm sewing the rest of them. So I'm just going to repeat the process by putting my thread through the next set of holes. And we're going to continue right down this row, making sure to leave that bottom row without any curls. Okay, and so that is our last curl right there. We're going to leave that empty. Now I'm going to grab my second pen and I'm going to put it right over the next row here. Okay. I'm going to come back up to the very top here. And I'm going to sew my loop right around this one. Okay, we've got our 3 loops. We're going to continue right down this row until we run out of thread and have to put some more on our needle. Okay, and so I have made my final loop here. What I'm going to do now is remove this pen and I'm going to move it over here. Now I like to use 2 because if you're only using 1, what may happen is as you pull this one out and start over here, the first couple of loops that you make here might get pulled a little tight and it'll take the thread from the very last one here. So it'll distort the size of the curls here. And that's why I like to use 2 pens. So just continue making the rest of your curls. Okay, so at this point, I'm at the end of my 3rd row and I'm running short on thread. So I actually have 2 different options of dealing with this thread. I can go ahead and grab the tail from the very first row and tie a loose knot here, making sure that I'm not pulling any of the leather pieces together. Or what I like to do is, as I sew the next row, I'll lay this one down the middle of the row with the tail of the starter thread for this row, and I'll just sew right over the 2 of them like I did with this one, and it'll be perfectly fine. Okay, I'm going to start out by making my first loop, leaving this tail a little long. I'm going to join it up with the other one, and I'm just going to hold it in place with my thumb. And as we move down this row, I will catch both of those under the thread. Okay, and now you can see I'm starting to cross over those stitches here, and we're going to start to secure them down. Right, you see how both of those are caught under that stitch right there? I'm going to do that for the rest of this row, making sure that I'm leaving this very bottom one empty of curls. And here I finished my very last curl loop, so I'm going to finish off this stitch by coming under one of the tan stitches here. going to pull my needle through. This can get a little tricky because those stitches are pretty tight. Flip my needle up and put it right back through there. Okay. And then I'm going to cut this thread a little on the long side so that way I can just shove it right back into the head as I'm sewing on the back. And this is what your pincushion should look like at this stage. Now grab piece number 5. This is the one with a logo, and this is going to be the very back of our pincushion. And when it's all sewn on, we're going to use a saddle stitch for this one. It's a new stitch. It's going to bring in our little doll, so that way it starts to look more like the final pincushion image. As I mentioned, we're going to be using a saddle stitch to attach this to the top pincushion part. So grab the last of your thread and attach needles to both ends. Now the back of your pincushion has a little tiny black dot on one of his arms, and that's going to correspond with one of the black dots on the top part. So place your needle through the one with the black mark, starting on the side that has the logo, and then we're going to put it through the other one. And pull your thread so that way your needles are even. So this is what it should look like at this point. You've got one thread going through both. Now take your needle from this end, put it through the very next needle, over the stitches and through the needle, and then we're going to put it through that hole and pull that through. Grab the other end, so this needle right here, we're going to put that through the same exact hole that we just put the other thread through. Okay. And when you tighten it, you're going to end up with a stitch like this. We've got one stitch and a thread coming out the hole on both ends. We're going to repeat that. There's the first hole. Okay, there's a needle going back through. And tighten. And now you can see we've got 2 stitches. We're going to continue this stitch all the way around the head, and we're going to stop right after we stitch past this right here. You want to make sure that you're leaving that hole, so don't close it completely because we still need to add the fluff. So go ahead and continue your saddle stitch around the head. Now note, this head is much larger than this one, so the holes do get tighter around the top of this head, and then it starts to loosen back up around the rest of the body. And that's the way it's supposed to be. So you might have to look for the holes a bit as you're going around the head with your needle, but they will absolutely match up. So just trust the process. If at any point during your saddle stitch you find that you're running a little low on thread, I'm going to show you how you can stop this by back stitching and then restart the stitch after you've rethreaded your needles. So first what we want to do is we want to secure this stitch by back stitching. So we are simply going to pull these needles back through the holes. the same way like when we were going forward. And we're going to make sure that both of the needles land on the bottom side of our project. In this case, the black side. Okay, so now that is back stitched. Trim and melt those ends. Okay, and now grab your rethreaded needles, and we are going to start in the same exact hole where we left off. And keep on doing your saddle stitch from here on out. And we'll do a couple of stitches here so that way you can see what it looks like. So I just completed sewing around the head and one half of the arm here with my saddle stitch, and you can see that the head is really starting to look nice here. Now, one thing I did want to mention is that if you end up with any little threads like that that are hanging out, don't worry about that. Don't let that drive you nuts, because we're going to take care of that at the very end in our last step. All right, so now I'm just going to continue sewing around using my saddle stitch. And so now I am stopping at this point. I have sewn just past these stitches here, and I have a hole here. So now I am going to add my fluff. Make sure that you get fluff down into the head portion of this and into all of his little arms and stuff. You might have to put your finger in if your finger doesn't fit entirely. Maybe use one of your pens, but make sure that you are stuffing it tight and that there's stuffing in all of the limbs. Okay, and after you have as much stuffing as you can fit down in there, go ahead and continue saddle stitching, and then I'll show you how to backstitch at the very end. Okay, I have now completed my last stitch right there. Now we need to backstitch, and I want to make sure that as I'm backstitching, my threads both end up on this side, because we're going to want to melt the thread on the back side where it's not as visible. Okay, so I've got the one stitch there. And then I'm going to take this one right back to the back. Trim both of your threads. Grab your lighter. Okay, I've got the one melted. Let's do the other. Okay. Now, you may notice that there's a little bit of fuzz maybe floating around. Just go ahead and lightly, very quickly burn it away. Same with any threads that might be hanging out. Just burn those out the way. And then the last thing that you may want to consider doing is checking your holes to make sure that there is fluff underneath all of those limbs. And if not, you can kind of push it around to make sure that the fluff is sufficient. And there you go. That's your completed VooDoo Doll Pincushion. You should feel really proud of yourself because you just made that.